So the demographic situation is the worst in world history. And the Chinese are in the process of updating their data. And they're now admitting, like since the book came out, they're admitting that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, all of whom would have been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago. Yeah, so we're already looking at a demographic structure that's not even in decline. It's in full collapse, and there will not be enough people aged 40 and under in China by 2030 to maintain any version of any economic system that we have yet to dream up in our heads. We don't even have a theory for what this might look like. Closer to home, we expect the energy flows from the Russian space to be disrupted. The Chinese are the ones at the end of that chain. So they're probably going to have to suck up the entirety of the shortage. That is more than enough to trigger something far worse than the 1970s oil crises, but specifically for China. Third, Xi has become the strongest cult of personality in human history. And he's consolidated more power to himself than any human in history, including Caligula. It's impossible now for him to get information because people won't bring it to him because they're scared of what he'll do because they don't know whether or not it's going to make him happy or sad. So he's completely isolated. And so all he's doing basically is drinking Kool-Aid. He's drinking the Russian Kool-Aid and believing them on energy policy. He's drinking Chinese policy and he's believing that China's propaganda on tech policy. And on COVID, we're seeing the whole thing starting to fall apart. What people forget about managing a system is it requires a lot of fingers and eyes. And the strength of the American system is its noise. We have a federal government, state governments, local governments, a business community, a civic community, an academic community. They all have their own sources of power, and they all have their own sources of legitimacy. And the glory and the horror of the American system is how they rub against each other and clash. That noise that oftentimes Americans think of as a negative is actually a huge positive, because it means if one of them completely collapses, the others don't. And we still have a governing system that keeps the system moving forward. Well, China has one person. It's not even the CCP anymore. They've become a cult of personality. It's one guy. The policies stop with him. And even if he was the smartest human in history, and he was not willing to shoot the messenger regularly, which he is, there is just too much going on for one guy to manage, especially in a country with over 1 billion people. And so with this COVID thing now, we were seeing protests, large protests involving thousands of people in every major city. They conflate accurately opposition to the COVID policies with Xi. And so we're seeing the Winnie the Pooh with the blank piece of paper protests. That's a real problem because every protest is automatically about Xi personally. And this is going to go one of two ways. Option A, the protests continue, they spin out of control because they're protesting now literally everything. And that is national dissolution. Option B, Xi reasserts control and we get a lockdown that looks a lot more like Tiananmen than what we've seen so far at the same time that we've now had hundreds of super spreader events in the last 8 days. And the lockdowns they're going to have to do for COVID are going to look like what happened in Shanghai a couple months, but almost everywhere. Well, remember that the Chinese vaccines don't work at all against Omicron. So it's not just the old people that are in danger here. We've seen a significant exodus out of the Chinese system since the last year of the Obama administration. It's accelerated every year for different reasons, but not everybody has started that process. Apple's by far the one that has been the slowest and is dragging its feet and has taken every example of trade disputes or genocides and just ignored them and doubled down, and now they're screwed. Herbert Walker Bush was the last president that tried to get Americans to have a conversation about the shape of the world we wanted to see in the post-Cold War environment, and we punished him for it. Clinton had his pros and his negatives, so did W. Bush, but both of them were governors and they actually governed. We may disagree with their ideology and some of their choices, but they both actually attempted to be president. Obama did not. Obama, he was kind of a one-man show. His first meeting with the Joint Chiefs, he told them bluntly that I'm smarter than all of you and I can do all of your jobs better than you. And let's assume for the moment that that was true. He couldn't do all of their jobs in his own, and so he ended up doing no one's. This is a guy who had never managed anything in his life. He had managed a 12-man campaign office as he was going for junior senator. That was his first grown-up job, period. And then he became president. He had no idea how to manage an organization with over 3 million people, and it showed. And so he basically locked himself in the Oval Office for 8 years. In 8 years, we got one law, Obamacare, and the White House didn't write it. He had Congress do it, which is part of why it's such a mess. Then we got Trump. I think people are a little bit more familiar with what happened during the Trump administration. Not exactly what I would call outcome-based policy. Say what you will about Biden, you can disagree with everything that he does. Dude's trying. And we haven't had that for the previous 12 years. So while there's a lot of things about Biden I'm not thrilled with, I would say that the jury's still out on whether he's going to be a decent president. I would say right now, however, he is a president, which is something we didn't have for 12 years. Part of what made globalization work is that the Americans sublimated their own geographic advantages. I mean, we basically have the best part of a continent all to ourselves, and metabolizing that land has been the American story from Reconstruction until World War II. That didn't end because of World War II. So we entered World War II as by far the most powerful country in human history. And when the war was ended, all the meaningful competitors were smashed. So we were unassailable. And we decided to use that power disconnect to rebuild parts of the world and put them in an advantage to us. It didn't matter what their geography was. They were allowed to access the world as if they had won because our Navy ensured it. They were able to access our market as if they had won because we saw that as a way to bring them up to speed to help fight the Cold War. So we took everything that we had going for us and pushed it to the side to help everyone else grow. Assuming we're complete pricks about this and we withdraw all that assistance, the growth story is immense because all of a sudden geography and demography is going to be working for us again. And if we decide we want partners in this process, then we can still have economies of scale as well. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at most likely Southeast Asia, Japan, Mexico, Canada, and then parts of Western Europe that are going to be brought along for the ride. So we get kind of the best of all worlds. We have the millennials for the youth. We have the boomers for the capital. We have our partners for economies of scale and differentiation. And we have to double the size of the industrial plant to replace the parts of the world that aren't going to be brought along. This is going to be the fastest growth story in American history, and it's going to last for a decade. And at the tail end of that, we will have supply chains that are shorter, simpler, cleaner, employing locals, selling to locals, and largely immune to international stresses. This is a really positive story. This is really getting into the book number 3, Disunited Nations, which talks about the countries of the future that we think of, the Chinas, the Russias, the Brazils, and why they won't be, and why a different set of countries is going to rise up and kind of take command of their own destiny in their own regions, the Frances, the Argentinas, the Turkeys. And there's a lot of dead space between the power centers of the future that are going to have a feel like the old Roman marches where population density drops off, where industry stops, and it's a bit of a no man's land. The countries that are actually going to do well in a more disorderly world are all in part powerful because they are nation states. And if anything, I see their authority strengthening. And of the major ones, the only one that kind of has a heterogeneous makeup is the United States, and I don't think that's going to change. So our view of the nation state in the United States, I think, is solid. And for the Frances and the Turkeys and the Argentinas of the world, I think their nation state identity is also very solid. But the places that are going to break down, I totally agree. Because for demographic reasons, we're actually seeing the disintegration of a lot of ethnicities in real time. And if you break that, then you can't have the nation state without the nation. And that is going to force new economic models. Now, we don't get that in 10 years. We probably don't get that in 30 years, but we are definitely seeing the stage set for whatever is next. So Japan is the only country who has seen this coming and who has anticipated what needed to be done. And they found a way to make friends on both sides of the American political aisle. So Japan has chosen to not be a challenger, but to work alongside the United States. That is the only significant power that I see for the next 30 years that could theoretically challenge the United States, and they're now part of the family.